Before this story begins, a brief word about the man who made it possible. Anthony Bourdain and Mark Lanegan shared a deep and unlikely friendship, two men united by rock music, melancholy, and the long shadow of their own excess. Two survivors who understood, without needing to explain, exactly what the other had been through. In November 2017, Bourdain brought Mark onto Parts Unknown, his celebrated CNN series, for the Seattle episode. They sat together and talked about the city's transformation, about gentrification, about what had been lost. Two men who had lived through the Seattle that the world romanticized, now watching it become something else entirely. It was Bourdain who pushed Mark to write his memoir, not just a rock biography, but something frank, visceral, and unsparing. He encouraged him to take the same honesty he put into his lyrics and apply it to prose. The result was Sing Backwards and Weep, published in 2020. Mark dedicated it simply, "For Tony and all my other absent friends." Anthony Bourdain died on June 8, 2018, before the book was finished. He was 61 years old. He never got to read it, but without him, it might never have existed. Kurt was dead, and Mark Lanegan was selling crack outside his own building to buy heroin. This is what survival looked like in Seattle, 1994. Not redemption, not clarity, just a man in a wooden chair, too afraid to lie down, convinced that if he closed his eyes, he wouldn't wake up. While somewhere across the city, Lane Staley was quietly disappearing into the same darkness. Two of the greatest voices that scene ever produced. One of them wasn't going to make it. The other barely would. Lane had gone to Minnesota for rehab. Mark wished him well, genuinely. He supported anyone who wanted to get clean. He just didn't believe it would stick. Neither Kurt nor Lane had ever believed Mark would get clean either. Both had told him so, at different times. They figured they'd kick it themselves one day. As for Mark, his hunger was too ferocious, the distances he'd traveled too extreme. They were probably right about him. They were wrong about themselves. Lane came back healthy, heavier, the best Mark had ever seen him look. He showed up at Mark's door straight from the airport, still buzzing, desperate to use. "You sure you want to do this?" Mark asked. "You just got out. You're actually clean right now." "All I thought about in there was getting out and getting high. I never wanted to stop. I only did it to shut everyone up." He cooked a shot in Mark's kitchen, vomited in the sink the moment it hit, walked into the living room with a stupid grin, sat on the couch, and slept for hours. Mark made him promise not to tell Jerry Cantrell or anyone from Alice in Chains that he'd relapsed at Mark's place. He kept the secret. While Alice in Chains wanted Lane in the studio, he disappeared into his apartment instead. Mark spent days there with him, smoking crack, shooting heroin. The two of them locked in Lane's bedroom, while a well-meaning roommate named Johnny watched from the outside, growing quieter and more defeated each visit, until one day he simply moved out. Without Johnny there, they sank further. One night, Lane called Mark in a panic. "Door unlocked. Come now." Mark used their private knock sequence, heard Lane scream from inside. "Get in here!" The door was unlocked, which meant something was wrong. Lane never left his door unlocked. Mark found him on the bathroom floor, face down, head behind the toilet, staring at a small hole in the wall. "They're back," Lane whispered. "I was asleep and I woke up and they were coming out of my arm." "Who was?" "The spiders. I crawled them back in there. I need to kill them before they take over the whole place." Mark had spent a Christmas Eve once in a psychiatric ward with a childhood friend with paranoid schizophrenia. He recognized what he was looking at. Lane rolled up his sleeve. A swollen, infected abscess ran along his forearm. The crack psychosis had built an entire narrative around the wound. Mark talked him off the floor, convinced him to take a hit of heroin instead of the crack pipe, hoping it would level his mind. Then convinced him to come back to Mark's apartment, promising to call an exterminator. He kept Lane at his place for a week. "The sweetest, funniest, most magical and intelligent person I knew," Mark wrote later. "Completely lost. My love for him was so immense he had become something like my other half, the part of myself I had always been missing." After a few days, something behind Lane's eyes came back. He looked at Mark and said, almost casually, "I lost my fucking mind, didn't I?" The familiar, mischievous light was back. Mark started. Thank God you figured that out. I was afraid we were going to need the psych ward. Sorry, man. That was weird. Yeah, it was. But you're back. That's all that matters. Meanwhile, Lane had found something that mattered. Alice in Chains wasn't happening, but music still was. He called Mark one afternoon and asked him to come to the studio. When Mark arrived, the rest of Mad Season was nowhere to be found. Lane had cleared the room, just the two of them and a tape machine. We're going to write a song. You write a verse, I write a verse, back and forth. They passed a single sheet of paper between them for 45 minutes. Whatever one of them wrote gave the other the key to the next thought. Neither had ever written that way before. No argument, no negotiation. Just two people who had been through the same darkness finding words for it together. They called it Long Gone Day. 45 minutes, first take, done. Above, the Mad Season album came out later that year. It went gold. Mark received full songwriter royalties, which he hadn't expected and which moved him deeply. The most generous thing anyone in music had ever done for him. For less than 2 hours of what felt, genuinely, like fun, he had the check sent directly to him instead of through his accountant. A decision born from desperation that would later cost him significantly. But in that moment, standing in the wreckage of everything he had become, it felt like proof that something good could still come from all of it. That he and Lane, together, could still make something worth hearing.
This song is called Long Gone Day. Mr. Mark Lanegan.
So much blood, I'm starting to drown. It runs from cold to cold. Time to time, the sky's coming down to help me lose my way. Tears and lies for answers, you an open vein. But God knows I'm gone. Girl, I just want you to come on down. Lord, it's a storm in my head and I fall. These sins are mine and I done wrong. Oh baby, come on down. Come on down, my babe. I know it's been a long, long gone day. Whoever said we wash away with the rain?
Josh Homme and the Screaming Trees. By 1995, the Screaming Trees were falling apart from the inside. The band that had once come closest to breaking through, the band that had a hit on MTV, an epic records deal, and a follow-up to Sweet Oblivion that refused to get made, was now a group of men who could barely stand to be in the same room. It was in the middle of this slow collapse that a young guitarist showed up. Josh Homme had been in Kyuss, a desert rock band from Palm Springs that Mark was a genuine fan of. He was an acquaintance of Van Connor's, hired to play second guitar on a Lollapalooza run. Mark wasn't even at the rehearsal when they first played together, but the moment he heard who it was, he endorsed it without hesitation. I knew we were getting a steal. He was right, and not just musically. Homme was young, sharp, and had no interest in the dysfunction that had corroded the band for years. He'd hang in the back of the tour bus with Mark, not doing drugs, just talking, and turned out to be exactly the kind of thoughtful, grounded presence the Trees had never had. Funny, curious, brutally honest. He told Mark he'd actually been planning to quit music altogether before the offer came. He'd moved to Seattle to go to college. Instead, he ended up as the only person on that tour bus Mark genuinely respected. He had more talent and creativity in him than the rest of the band combined, Mark wrote. His presence was my saving grace from that moment until the eventual end of the band. Two misfits in a band that had already given up on itself, watching the Ramones kill it every night from the side of the stage, laughing at the absurdity of everything around them. Neither of them knew yet what they would eventually build together: cotton fever. After Demry died, Lane didn't want to be alone. He moved into Mark's small one-bedroom apartment and brought the ruins of his life with him. For months, they lived in a squalor that had its own terrible rhythm, smoking crack, shooting heroin, laughing until they lost their voices one moment, nodding into oblivion the next. Lane never stopped grieving. The apartment smelled like burnt spoons and candle wax and something that had no name. Then Phil arrived. Phil Staley, Lane's father, also an addict. He took over the role of runner, fetching drugs when neither of them had the energy or the nerve to hit the streets. Mark found him to be exactly what you'd expect from the man who had produced Lane: sweet, funny, smart, and completely destroyed by the same disease. The physical resemblance was uncanny. Father and son, mirror images, separated by decades and united by the needle. But Lane couldn't stand to see it. Whenever Phil caught a nod on the couch, head drooping, body slack, the same posture Lane himself assumed every day, Lane would videotape him, then force him to watch it back, ridiculing his own father for doing the exact same thing they all did, every single day. Mark watched in silence. He understood the cruelty. It was a man raging at his own reflection. The first time Mark had encountered Demry Parrott, it had been years earlier, in the shadowy yard of a Capitol Hill dope house. He was there to score. So was she. She was Lane's girlfriend, also an acquaintance of Anna, Mark's own girlfriend at the time, which made what happened next the kind of thing you keep to yourself. "Are you here for what I'm here for?" Lane had asked that first night, smiling. Mark had said yes, but asked Lane not to mention it to Demry because of the Anna connection. He kept that secret. But Demry had her own ideas. She was wild, reckless, impossible to ignore. A woman who moved through the world like she'd already decided consequences didn't apply to her. The first time she'd seen Mark outside a dope house on Capitol Hill, she'd walked straight up to him. "Hey, aren't you Anna's boyfriend?" "I'm Demry." Then, without missing a beat, had invited him home. Mark declined. Barely. He never told Lane. He never told Anna. Some things you carry alone. Then came the morning he buzzed his door and found her on the steps. White hospital gown, IV pole, pacemaker scar running down the center of her chest. She was smiling like she'd won something. "I got endocarditis. They gave me a pacemaker. Mark, baby, do you have any dope? I'll even take cottons." Endocarditis, a bacterial infection of the heart, common among IV users, often fatal. She had just had open heart surgery. She had wheeled her IV pole out of the hospital and come straight to his door to get high. Mark stared at her. "Are you fucking kidding me? Get back to the hospital. You're out of your mind." He shut the door in her face mid-sentence, walked back upstairs, turned off the buzzer. He kept that one to himself too. He didn't want to give Lane any more heartache than he'd already taken. Demry Parrott died later that year. She was 27 years old. When the news reached Mark, his first thought wasn't about himself. It was about Lane. This is going to destroy him. He was right. Demry Parrott died in October 1996. The endocarditis she had contracted, the bacterial infection that destroys heart valves, common among intravenous drug users, had done its work. The pacemaker she'd been carrying in her chest the day she showed up at Mark's door in a hospital gown wasn't enough to save her. When the news came, Mark was on tour in Europe. Kevin Wilkins knocked on his hotel room door with the kind of look that didn't need words. Lane called right after. "Oh man, I can't believe it. She's gone." And then he broke completely. Mark stayed on the line without knowing what to say. He never did. But he stayed. Lane had loved Demry with an intensity that burned everything around it. After their final breakup, one of many in years of turbulent back and forth, he had made a quiet decision. If it wasn't her, he preferred to be alone. And alone was what he became. The bottom. The years between 1995 and 1999 passed in accelerating free fall. The Screaming Trees made one last record. Mark opened for Johnny Cash, performing songs from his solo work for a man he'd admired his whole life. None of it was enough to interrupt the descent. He was selling crack outside his building to pay for heroin, sleeping upright in a wooden chair, too afraid to lie down, convinced that if he closed his eyes horizontally, he wouldn't wake up. His feet were rotting. His arms were destroyed. He was 33 years old and looked twice that. He burned every bridge, stole from everyone, ripped off dealers, friends, strangers. Eventually had to flee his own neighborhood when a dealer named Donnie tracked him down to the house where he was crashing, screaming his real name in the street. "You fucked the wrong guy, Mark. You're dead, Red. You're fucking dead." He stood on a corner, dope-sick, skeletal at 165 pounds, open wounds on both arms, his only possession a piss-yellow corduroy coat from 1993. There was nowhere left to go. The way out. Months earlier, a pawn shop owner named Rob had mentioned something. Courtney Love had come into the shop looking for Mark. She'd left information about a program in California, the Musician's Assistance Program, that helped artists with addiction. "Fuck that," Mark had said at the time. "Tell her to shove her rehab." Now, with Donnie hunting him and nowhere to sleep, he walked the mile down to the shop. "What was that thing Courtney left for me?" Rob smiled. He'd been waiting a long time for that question. Within 10 minutes, Mark was booked on a flight to Los Angeles. His plan was to get off the plane and hit the streets. He shot up twice on the flight, arrived so high he could barely walk. A large security man was waiting for him at the gate. He ended up at Las Encinas Hospital in Pasadena, a psychiatric facility. Not what he expected. He sat shivering outside the intake office next to an elderly woman in a bathrobe who just finished electroshock treatment. They gave him phenobarbital. He slept for days, dreaming the same dream over and over, the room bursting into flames, walls and ceiling and floor, himself included. On the 5th day, the storm outside broke. An orderly set him up in a lawn chair on the hospital grounds. California sun. Clean clothes. Courtney had sent bags of new clothes to his room while he slept. Short hair, white bandages from wrist to elbow on both arms. He sat there alone and started laughing, then laughing maniacally. "I'm still here, motherfuckers. You can't kill me." And then, without warning, the laughter became uncontrollable sobbing. Tears pulled from somewhere he hadn't accessed in years. In that moment, out of pure desperation, with no premeditation, with no belief system behind it, he said out loud, "God, change me." He had never believed in God, had hated Mass, hated funerals, hated the soup kitchen prayer lines. He didn't know who he was calling out to. The second he said it, something hit him, like a shotgun blast, like 16 hits of acid at once. He was knocked from the chair. His entire life flashed before him, not as a cliché, but as a real, physical, overwhelming experience. Every theft, every lie, every person he'd used and discarded, every door he'd let close, every phone call he hadn't answered. In 1 second, I saw that my entire life's way of thinking and behaving was the corrupted opposite of what it should be. He lay in the grass, sobbing. When he got up, something had changed. Not by any god he could name, but by something real, something that had intervened in the life of one sad piece of human wreckage the moment it was asked to. In order to survive, I would have to change every single fucking sorry thing about myself. Lane. After almost a year in treatment facilities and halfway houses in California, much of it funded by Courtney Love, Mark came back. He got clean, stayed clean. Josh Homme, his young friend from the final days of the Screaming Trees, had started Queens of the Stone Age and asked Mark to come along. It was a new life. But some ghosts don't leave. He was recording in Houston when the call came. His accountant, Lori Davis, one of the only people from his old life who had never stopped caring, was on the line. "Mark, please sit down. I'm so sorry. It's going to hurt." He already knew. "Lane?" "Yes, honey. He's gone." April 2002. Lane Staley had been dead in his Seattle apartment for 2 weeks before anyone found him. He died on the same date as Kurt Cobain, April 5th, 8 years later, almost to the day. It was a call I had expected for years, but it destroyed me nonetheless. His loss left a void I've felt every day since. I expect I always will. Epilogue. Seattle, a city that gave the world a sound and then consumed most of the people who created it. Andrew Wood, the singer of Mother Love Bone, the original Flame, was first, March 19, 1990. Then Kurt Cobain, April 1994. Kristen Pfaff, June 1994. Lane Staley, April 2002. Van Connor, Mark's oldest friend, the first person who ever believed in him, January 2023. Mark Lanegan himself had one last encounter with death before the final one. In 2021, he contracted COVID-19 and fell into a medically induced coma for months. He survived, barely, and wrote about it in a book called Devil in a Coma. It read like a man reporting from the border between worlds, a man who had spent his entire life flirting with that border and had crossed it once more and come back. He had relocated to Ireland with his wife, Shelley Brian. Green hills, rain, distance from everything Seattle had meant. On the morning of February 22, 2022, Mark Lanegan died at his home in Killarney. He was 57 years old. No official cause of death was ever released by his family. And somehow, for a man who spent his life guarding his own darkness, that feels right. He had a poem that ended with the line, "And let me keep my own shit to myself." Eddie Vedder paid tribute, Iggy Pop, Nick Cave, the people who understood what that voice had meant, what it cost to produce it, what it carried inside it. He had every reason to be another name on that list. For most of his life, he was trying to be, but somewhere between the music and the grief, between the years of slow self-destruction and one impossible morning on a hospital lawn in Pasadena when he looked up at the sky and asked out loud to be changed, something held. A voice that survived when it had no business surviving. A man who looked honestly into the mirror of his own life, saw clearly what he found there, and chose, finally, improbably, after everything, to still be here. For a while longer. The book was called Sing Backwards and Weep. He sang it the only way he ever knew how. Backwards, weeping. And for a long time, impossibly, stubbornly, beautifully, alive. Thank you for watching. If this story meant something to you, subscribe. More documentaries coming on the most extraordinary musicians to ever walk this earth. See you on the next one at Music Ludo.